He's the #1 challenger, and still he don't get a shot at the title. So working with a guy like Sylvester Stallone, he's a perfectionist. There might be people that just don't like you for whatever reason. A lot of people out there don't like me.
It was in the Bible. You know, you find pity so many times in the Bible and food so many times. So I put him together.
The story usually begins in a low, rumbling voice, the kind that feels like a warning before a storm breaks, because that is how Mr. T himself often spoke about those early Hollywood years. With his heavy gold chains catching the studio lights, his fierce stare, and that unforgettable mohawk, he was never meant to slide comfortably into Hollywood's neat little boxes. He looked different, sounded different, and came from a world far removed from casting offices and red carpets. So when he later said there were 6 actors he truly couldn't stand working with, people leaned in, not because it sounded scandalous, but because it sounded honest. These weren't rumors whispered at parties or cheap tabloid lines. They were stories pulled from interviews, biographies, and long-remembered set tensions, repeated consistently over decades. But before any names are spoken, it's important to understand the atmosphere around them, because Hollywood in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a pressure cooker. It was brutal, deeply competitive, and often unforgiving to outsiders who didn't know the unspoken rules. Mr. T arrived like a wrecking ball, loud, proud, and unapologetically different, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had already survived real fights long before stepping onto a soundstage. Some actors admired that energy and saw him as refreshing. Others felt threatened by his sudden fame and the attention he commanded from audiences who instantly connected with him. Behind the scenes, crews reportedly watched the tension grow as egos collided under hot studio lights and long shooting days. Over the years, reporters noticed patterns in Mr. T's recollections. Moments when he felt talked down to, situations where power was flexed unnecessarily, and subtle slights that lingered far longer than shouted arguments ever could. He often recalled how respect mattered more to him than screen time or billing, a value shaped by his life before fame as a bodyguard and bouncer, where trust and dignity were survival tools. Importantly, he never claimed secret crimes or dark conspiracies, and he avoided painting himself as a victim of hidden plots. Instead, he spoke about personal animosity, clashes of values, and what he felt was open hostility or cold dismissal. In later reflections, he even admitted that some of these conflicts were fueled by the era itself, a time when Hollywood was struggling with change and uncomfortable with voices that didn't fit traditional molds. As we move through this story, it's crucial to remember that these are not courtroom verdicts or official records, but human memories shaped by pressure, pride, exhaustion, and fame. Memory softens some edges and sharpens others. The full list of names didn't come out at once, either. It emerged piece by piece, through stories told long after the cameras stopped rolling, when careers were secure enough for honesty and the silence of the past no longer felt necessary. To understand why those conflicts mattered so much, you have to understand who Mr. T was before Hollywood ever learned his name, because his story didn't begin on a soundstage, it began on the streets of Chicago. Born Lawrence Turode, he grew up in a tough environment where respect wasn't a slogan, it was survival. He was one of 12 children, raised in a small apartment, and from an early age he learned discipline the hard way. Long before cameras followed him, he built his body through sheer will, turning strength into a form of protection, both for himself and for others. He worked as a bouncer and a bodyguard, guarding nightclubs, standing watch at concerts, and eventually protecting famous musicians like Muhammad Ali, Steve McQueen, and Diana Ross. Those years shaped his worldview. In later interviews, he often said that when you stand between danger and another human being, you learn quickly who deserves respect and who abuses power. When Hollywood discovered him, it was during an era obsessed with tough men, larger-than-life heroes, and box office muscle, but most of those stars came from acting schools, casting agencies, and carefully managed careers. Mr. T did not. He was raw, unfiltered, and real, and that made him both magnetic and unsettling. He wasn't polished, and he didn't pretend to be, often saying he would rather be honest than liked. His breakout role as Clubber Lang in Rocky III didn't just make him famous, it made him unforgettable, turning him into a symbol of controlled rage and working-class strength. Almost overnight, he became a cultural icon, and his later success on television cemented him as a household name. But the industry he entered was ruled by hierarchies and unspoken rules that no one bothered to explain to newcomers. Veteran actors expected deference simply because they had been there longer. Producers expected obedience and silence. Mr. T, shaped by a world where respect had to be mutual to mean anything, expected to be treated as an equal once he showed up and did the work. That clash of expectations created sparks almost immediately. In interviews, he often said he didn't hate easily and didn't go looking for conflict, but once someone crossed a line, especially with disrespect or arrogance, he never forgot it. This was also a time when typecasting and racial stereotypes were deeply embedded in Hollywood, and roles for actors who looked like him were limited and often loaded with assumptions. On sets, actors fought quietly and sometimes openly for screen time, status, and control, while agents and studios fanned those tensions behind the scenes. In that pressure cooker, even small slights, a dismissive comment, a cold look, or a power move during rehearsals, could grow into lasting resentment. Looking back, Mr. T often framed the 6 actors he later named not as cartoon villains, but as symbols of an era's worst habits, an industry struggling with change, threatened by outsiders, and uncomfortable with voices that refused to bow. One of the earliest and most talked about tensions involved Sylvester Stallone, a name often mentioned carefully and deliberately in Mr. T's recollections, as if even decades later he weighed every word. While Rocky III undeniably launched his career into the stratosphere, Mr. T later described the set as less of a celebration and more of a battleground defined by creative control and clashing personalities. In published interviews and retrospective biographies, he recalled feeling underestimated during the early days of production, treated primarily as raw muscle rather than a performer with instincts and ideas of his own. Stallone, already an established star, writer, and driving force behind the franchise, ran a famously tight ship, controlling tone, pacing, and even subtle character beats. According to Mr. T, the friction wasn't about open hostility or dramatic blow-ups, but about respect and recognition, the quiet power struggles that happen when 2 strong personalities occupy the same space. He later said he understood Stallone's position but wished there had been more acknowledgement of his contribution beyond physical presence. That theme of recognition carried over into television, where another name frequently appears in biographies and behind-the-scenes accounts, George Peppard, his co-star on the A-Team. Multiple cast members, not just Mr. T, spoke openly over the years about long-standing tension on that set, describing an atmosphere where egos collided daily. Mr. T described Peppard as distant and dismissive, someone who, in his view, resented the overwhelming attention Mr. T received from fans, especially younger audiences who lined up just to see him. Interviews from the era suggest Peppard struggled with the show's tone and his own declining film career, which may have deepened the divide. Then there was Dirk Benedict, another A-Team actor, who Mr. T reportedly felt mocked his image off camera, making jokes about his look and persona that crossed the line from humor into disrespect. Benedict later admitted in interviews that the set was deeply divided, filled with rivalry, insecurity, and competing ambitions, and that harmony was more performance than reality. Dwight Schultz has also been mentioned in various accounts as part of that strained ensemble, not as an antagonist, but as someone caught in the crossfire, navigating tension while trying to keep peace. Schultz himself later acknowledged the atmosphere was challenging, with personalities pulling in different directions. Taken together, these stories don't paint monsters or villains lurking behind studio doors. They paint men trapped in the pressure cooker of fame, tight schedules, and massive expectations, each believing they were right, each guarding pride as fiercely as their careers, and each leaving behind memories shaped as much by stress as by truth. As Mr. T's fame grew, so did his reputation for speaking his mind, and in Hollywood that trait can open doors while quietly closing others, and over time it added 2 more names to the list he would later allude to in interviews. In quieter conversations and long-form reflections, he referred to actors he encountered only briefly, on shared sets, at award shows, or during industry events, men who, in his view, showed open disrespect toward him or the life he came from. One such actor, often identified indirectly in Hollywood reporting though rarely quoted by name, was someone who mocked his appearance in casual remarks, treating his gold chains, mohawk, and tough persona as a costume rather than a statement. Mr. T later explained that those chains were not fashion accessories in his mind, but symbols of survival and self-made pride, inspired by the jewelry he recovered while working security and his promise to wear gold so people would look at him instead of the poor communities he came from. To have that dismissed as a joke, he said, felt like an attack on his history. Another actor, whose name surfaced in tabloid profiles and memoir discussions years later, reportedly dismissed him as a fad, assuming his popularity would fade once the novelty wore off. According to Mr. T, that comment wasn't delivered in anger, but in a tone of casual superiority, which made it sting even more. He took it personally not because of wounded ego, but because he believed it reflected a broader pattern in Hollywood, where outsiders were tolerated only as long as they stayed in their lane. He later said that many in the industry loved the image he brought, but not the man behind it, the discipline, values, and boundaries he refused to compromise. These weren't explosive confrontations with shouting matches, slammed doors, or physical threats, despite the tough image people often projected onto him. They were quiet moments, sideways looks, dismissive comments, jokes said just loudly enough to be heard, and attitudes that lingered long after the event ended. In the world of Hollywood, those moments can be more damaging than open conflict, because they shape reputations and relationships in silence. Over time, Mr. T grouped these men together as examples of what he hated most in the industry: arrogance without empathy, success without humility, and power without respect. Even then, he often paused to clarify that hate was a strong word, and that what he really felt was disappointment. He had hoped success would create bridges, that shared achievement would lead to understanding and unity, but instead he found that fame often magnified divisions, exposing insecurities and prejudices that had been there all along. Looking back, Mr. T's stories feel less like a scorecard of grudges and more like a collection of lessons learned the hard way inside a ruthless industry that rarely slows down long enough for reflection. He often said in interviews that fame doesn't change people so much as it reveals them, and the 6 actors he named represented moments when he felt that revelation with painful clarity. Under pressure, he believed, character rises to the surface, whether it is generosity or insecurity, humility or ego. Yet what often gets overlooked is that he also spoke openly about growth, forgiveness, and the passage of time. Years later, he admitted that some of the anger he once carried softened as he gained distance from the chaos of constant production schedules and public scrutiny. Certain relationships mellowed when competition faded, while others simply dissolved into memory, no longer important enough to hold on to. What remains powerful is not the conflict itself, but how openly he talked about respect, especially during an era when many actors chose silence to protect their careers and public images. At a time when studio politics could quietly end opportunities, speaking honestly came with risk, and Mr. T understood that risk well. He often said he wasn't trying to tear anyone down, but to stand up for himself and others who felt invisible or dismissed. His reflections remind us that Hollywood legends are not carved from marble, but built by flawed human beings navigating pressure, jealousy, ambition, and fear. Behind the polished premieres and carefully managed interviews are long days, bruised egos, and moments where one comment can echo for years. Importantly, none of these accounts claim absolute truth or present themselves as final judgments. They are recollections shaped by time, emotion, and personal experience, colored by how memory works when careers and identities are on the line. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes them compelling. They show the cost of fame behind the glamour, the emotional toll that rarely makes it into highlight reels or award speeches. Mr. T often framed his experiences as cautionary tales, reminders that success without respect feels hollow, and recognition without dignity is never enough. In later years, as he stepped back from the spotlight and focused on family, faith, and personal health battles, his tone shifted